you were researching at Roger Ibbotson and Gary Brinson's 1987 book, you came across evidence that the Balzac watermill near Toulouse operated with share trading, limited liability, and governance centuries before the Dutch East India Company. So how did you stumble across this discovery, and what made you realize it was significant?
Well, I don't remember where I first saw a reference to it, because this was 40 years ago, and I was reading about the history of capitalism and financial markets, and it occurred to me that if I was helping Gary Brinson and Roger Ibbotson write a book on investment markets with an emphasis on history, that I should at least mention that I had discovered through my reading that there was a company in France that had sold shares in itself and that they had traded as far back as the 1300s with some evidence of maybe the 11 or 1200s. So I mentioned this to a colleague, Will Getzman, who has since become a very famous finance professor. And of course, he can do some things I can't do. One of them was to get on an airplane and fly to France and spend, it must have been months, researching this. He co-authored a book, or maybe it was a series of papers, with a French guy who was already an expert on this particular security, the Balzac watermill in Toulouse, France. And so we have a funny, Will and I have a very pleasant relationship here, because he thinks I discovered it and I think he discovered it. But that's better than it being the other way. And but I even if I did discover the watermill being the first issuer of corporate equities, he did all the work and made it into something that people now read about and talk about. So the theme here is capitalism, and the idea of capital markets goes back as far in history as you can physically dig. And sometimes it is a dig. The archaeologists are finding that there were some kinds of markets back in the 3rd millennium BC, not necessarily capital markets, but markets where people could not only trade goods, but trade various kinds of risk, trade futures on olive oil or something like that.
I love this story. I think it's fascinating. And yeah, I mean, when you are studying in university, you learn that the first publicly traded company was a different one than this one that you are alluding to, the Dutch East India Company. Yeah, exactly. Right. The Dutch East India Company. And now it turns out that we have to update all the uni curriculums, I guess. But it's really, really interesting.
Well, the Dutch East India Company was the first widely held stock. And it was the first stock for which you have a reliable time series of data that goes all the way through. Will Getzman has constructed a time series for the Balzac watermill, but it has some assumptions. Sometimes you don't know what the dividend was, and the dividend was the only cash flow to the investor, because in those days stocks tended to be traded at par, and what varied was the dividend. So when the company was profitable, you got a big one, and when the company made a loss, you may be asked to put in more money, and so it may not have been completely limited liability. I know that Balzac had capital calls on the investors. I don't know about Dutch East India.
You've reached the end of this clip, but the story is not over. To watch the full episode, follow this link. Go on. You can do it.